It started on a damp October evening in a small town in Ohio, a place where the streets were lined with aging maple trees, their leaves turning shades of red and gold, and where the locals treated Halloween like a sacred ritual. I had moved into an old Victorian house at the edge of town, a property that had sat empty for nearly a year. The realtor had mentioned that the previous owner had left suddenly, but offered no explanation. The town itself was quiet, sleepy even, but there was an undertone, an odd stillness that only a newcomer would notice. I spent the day preparing for Halloween, cleaning the dusty corners of the house, unpacking boxes, and stringing up decorations. The house had an attic, accessible through a narrow staircase tucked behind the kitchen. The door was heavy and warped with age, secured by a rusted latch. The previous owner had left a note stuck to it in faded ink. "Do not disturb. After dark, it watches." I laughed it off, assuming it was some leftover joke or a way to make the house seem more mysterious for potential buyers. Still, I couldn't shake a small, gnawing sense of unease as I passed the door throughout the day. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the town came alive with costumed children and families. I had set up a small fire pit in the backyard, along with a few carved pumpkins glowing eerily in the twilight. I handed out candy, chatting with neighbors, while the wind whispered through the trees, carrying a faint metallic smell that I couldn't place. By 10 o'clock, the street was deserted, the laughter and footsteps fading into an oppressive silence. That's when I heard the first sound, a slow, deliberate creaking like someone walking across the attic floor above me. I told myself it was the house settling. Victorian houses make noises, but the creaking didn't stop. It was steady, paced, and unnervingly deliberate. I climbed the narrow staircase to the attic, flashlight in hand, trying to calm my racing heart. When I opened the door, the beam of light revealed only dust, old trunks, and stacks of newspapers dating back decades. Nothing seemed out of place, and yet there was a faint sense of being observed, as though unseen eyes were tracking my every move. I turned to leave, but then something caught my eye, a small box at the far end of the attic, one I hadn't noticed before. It was black, with deep scratches on its surface, as though it had been clawed. I knelt down, curiosity mixing with fear, and opened it. Inside were dozens of masks. Halloween masks, grotesque and faded, each with twisted, unnatural expressions. But what made my stomach turn was the faint outline of letters carved into the inside of the lids. "We see you." I stumbled back, dropping the box. The masks fell with a hollow clatter, their lifeless faces seeming to grin at me in the dim light. I heard a whisper then, soft, serpentine, "Don't look away." My flashlight flickered. The air grew colder, heavier, pressing against my chest. I scrambled down the stairs, but when I reached the kitchen, I found the front door had locked itself. I hadn't touched it. The whispering grew louder, echoing through the house, coming from all directions. I ran to the living room and turned on every light. The attic door was closed now, though I was certain I had left it open. A shadow moved behind the glass of the upstairs window, human in shape, but impossible in size. It crouched, shifting unnaturally, and I could see the hollow black eyes staring straight at me. I grabbed my phone and tried calling 911, but there was no signal. Every light flickered, then went out, leaving me in total darkness. That's when I heard it, a soft, dragging sound on the hardwood floor behind me, moving closer with every heartbeat. I ran outside, barefoot, into the chill of the night. The shadow lingered at the window, but didn't move. I didn't stop running until I reached my neighbor's porch. I banged on their door until they woke, disoriented. I tried explaining, but they stared at me like I was insane. When the police arrived, they searched the house. Nothing unusual. The attic was empty, the masks were gone, and the air was normal, warm even. They said I'd probably imagined the whole thing. Stress, overactive imagination, Halloween excitement. I wanted to believe them, I really did. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed in my car, parked across town, watching my house. Around 2 in the morning, I saw the shadow again, moving in the window, this time closer to the attic door. It stayed for hours, then vanished just before dawn. I went home the next morning, determined to rid the house of whatever haunted it. I burned the masks I could find in the fireplace, destroyed the box, and cleaned the attic thoroughly. I thought that would end it. Halloween came again the following year. I stayed with friends, far from that house, far from the street, trying to forget. But the night wasn't peaceful. Around midnight, I woke up to a whispering voice outside my window, faint but unmistakable. We remember. We wait. The voice carried the unmistakable cadence of the previous Halloween, the same slow, deliberate rhythm that had stalked me through the old Victorian house. Since then, every October, I feel it. Shadows lingering just outside my line of sight, cold drafts brushing past me in empty rooms, the sense of being watched. Always, no matter where I am. I've moved 3 times since then, but it doesn't matter. They follow. Halloween isn't just a date on the calendar. It's a reminder that some things, once awakened, never sleep. That night in Ohio taught me that terror doesn't need a face to haunt you. It only needs patience. I've learned not to open doors at night, not to touch old boxes, not to look into shadows for too long. And even now as I write this, I hear it. The whispering. The slow creak of floorboards, faint but unmistakable. They are still out there, waiting, watching. Patient as the dead leaves that swirl outside my window every October night. Story the end. It was Halloween night in a sleepy Pennsylvania town called Ashfield, a place that felt like it had been frozen in time since the 1950s. The streets were narrow, lined with aging brick houses, and the air carried that unmistakable chill of late October, the kind that made your skin prickle and your breath visible even when you weren't moving. I was 18, recently graduated high school, and desperate for something thrilling. My friends and I had been talking about doing something bold for Halloween, beyond the usual parties or trick-or-treating. That's when someone mentioned the old Drummond farmhouse, abandoned since the late 1970s, on the edge of town near the woods. The Drummond house was infamous. Locals whispered about it constantly, that a family had died there under mysterious circumstances, that neighbors swore they saw lights flicker in its windows, and that on Halloween, you could sometimes hear crying or whispering coming from inside. Of course, those kinds of stories were irresistible to a group of teenagers eager to prove our courage. I was skeptical, but curiosity is a powerful thing, and by the time the sun dipped below the horizon, my best friend Rachel, my cousin Kevin, and I were all piled into Kevin's beat-up truck, heading toward the outskirts of town. The drive was short but tense. The road narrowed as we approached the farmhouse, flanked by skeletal trees and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. The sky had turned that deep, bruised shade of indigo, the kind that feels alive and heavy, and the moon was hidden behind clouds. When we reached the house, even in the dim light of our flashlights, it was imposing. A 2-story wooden structure, paint chipped and gray, windows gaping like empty eyes. The front porch sagged under years of neglect, and the door hung crooked on its hinges. "This is insane," Rachel whispered, gripping my arm. Kevin smirked. "Insane is what makes it fun," he said. He was always the fearless one, the one who convinced the rest of us to do things we'd probably regret. I followed behind them as we stepped onto the porch, the wood groaning under our weight. A strange smell wafted from the house, damp, earthy, and faintly metallic. My stomach sank. We pushed the front door open and stepped inside. The air was instantly colder, denser, as if the house itself was inhaling and exhaling around us. Our flashlights cut narrow paths through the darkness, revealing peeling wallpaper, broken furniture, and dust thick enough to leave footprints. The silence was absolute, except for the occasional creak of the floor beneath our feet. I felt it immediately, a prickle at the back of my neck, the sensation of being watched. We explored the first floor carefully, moving from the living room to what must have been the dining room and then into the kitchen. Everything was decayed, the remnants of a life abruptly abandoned. Kevin found an old photograph on the floor, faded and torn, showing a family of 4, their faces strange and solemn. "Creepy," Rachel muttered. I nodded, but I couldn't look away. Something about the eyes in the photo felt wrong, like they were aware of us, like they followed our movements. We moved to the staircase. It was steep, narrow, and made of dark wood. The steps creaked ominously, and I hesitated. Kevin went first, Rachel after him, and I brought up the rear. Halfway up, I heard a whisper, soft, almost imperceptible. I froze. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. They both looked at me, frowning. "Hear what?" Kevin asked. Rachel shook her head. I wasn't imagining it. The whisper came again, closer, more urgent. "Go, now." I stepped closer to Rachel, who was pale and biting her lip. Kevin, ever the skeptic, shrugged it off. "It's just the wind or the house settling." Stop being paranoid. But the feeling intensified as we reached the second floor. The hallway stretched long, lined with closed doors. The air was colder here, and the shadows seemed heavier, darker, pressing in on the edges of our vision. We entered what appeared to be the master bedroom. The bed was stripped bare, the mattress yellowed and rotting. A broken dresser leaned against the wall, drawers hanging open. But what caught my attention was the mirror. Half of it was shattered, the fragments jagged and sharp, reflecting our flashlights in uneven patterns. And then I saw it, or thought I did. Movement in the reflection, just out of the corner of my eye. A figure, tall, shadowy, faceless, standing just behind Kevin. "Kevin," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He turned, confused. "What?" The shadow was gone. My heart raced. I tried to rationalize it, thinking it was just a trick of the light. Rachel, however, was crying quietly. "I don't like this," she whispered. "I want to go." I agreed, but before we could leave, a loud bang echoed from the hallway outside, followed by the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer. Kevin grabbed my arm. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his bravado gone. We fled the room, our flashlights bobbing wildly as we ran down the hall. The footsteps followed us, growing louder, heavier, like someone or something was chasing us. The whispering returned, now a chorus coming from every direction. "Leave, leave, leave." We stumbled down the stairs, past the living room, and toward the front door. As we reached the porch, the door slammed shut behind us, as if the house itself was expelling us. Rachel screamed, and Kevin tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. I pushed against it with all my strength, and finally it swung open. We tumbled onto the yard, gasping, hearts pounding, and ran to the truck without looking back. The drive home was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts. We didn't speak of the experience for weeks, but the effects lingered. I started having nightmares of the house, of shadows reaching for me, of whispers in the dark. Rachel moved away not long after, and Kevin became more withdrawn, jumpy, as if the house had followed us home in some way. Years later, I still drive past the Drummond farmhouse when I'm in that area, and the same chill hits me, the same sense of being watched. It hasn't changed. Still abandoned, still waiting, and every Halloween I swear I hear the whispers echoing faintly in the wind. "You came, you came." I learned that night that some places aren't meant to be explored, and some stories are true, even if they sound like legend. Story. The end. It was a brisk October evening in the small town of Maple Hollow, New Jersey, the kind of night where the air felt heavier than usual, thick with the smell of damp leaves and the faint tang of wood smoke from neighborhood chimneys. The streets were alive with children running from house to house, dressed as witches, superheroes, and monsters, their laughter echoing down narrow lanes lined with ancient oak trees. For most, Halloween was a night of joy, sugar highs, and harmless scares. But for the Harper family, it would become a night that would haunt them for years. The Harpers had just moved into an older home on the outskirts of town. The house was a sprawling two-story Victorian with peeling white paint, a sagging porch, and shutters that banged against the window frames when the wind picked up. Their realtor had assured them it was a fixer-upper with character, and while Emily Harper had been skeptical, her husband Tom saw it as the perfect family home. Their children, Sophie, 10, and Jake, 7, were thrilled to have a yard big enough for Halloween decorations and a front porch perfect for trick-or-treaters. For weeks leading up to Halloween, the Harpers decorated their home meticulously. Emily carved pumpkins with elaborate faces, hung fake cobwebs in the corners, and draped skeletons across the porch. Tom strung flickering orange lights around the yard, giving it the warm, inviting glow that Maple Hollow families prided themselves on. But as the holiday approached, strange things began to happen. At first, it was small. Doors that had been locked were found ajar, lights that had been turned off flickered on, and the children complained of whispers in their rooms at night. Emily dismissed it as the house settling, the wind or the overactive imagination of children excited by Halloween. But a deep unease began to grow in her stomach, one she couldn't ignore. On Halloween night, the family dressed up and prepared to take the kids around the neighborhood. Tom and Emily opted for classic costumes, Dracula and his bride, while Sophie chose a fairy outfit and Jake a tiny skeleton suit. The streets were crowded, filled with the energy of children and parents alike. The Harpers laughed and walked with the flow, enjoying the bright lights and cheerful chaos. It was when they reached the far end of Maple Street that things began to feel off. There was a house there that no one seemed to approach. It was large, imposing, and older than most of the other homes on the block, with dark, weathered bricks and tall, narrow windows. From inside, faint candlelight flickered, casting long shadows against the curtains, but no one answered when trick-or-treaters knocked. Sophie, drawn to the house despite Emily's warnings, tugged at her mother's hand. "Mom, can we go just look at it?" she asked. Emily hesitated. There was something unsettling about the house, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. But seeing the excitement in Sophie's eyes, she finally relented. "Okay, but just for a moment," she said. As they approached, the air grew colder, sharper. The wind whispered through the trees in a way that almost sounded like voices. On the porch sat a pumpkin unlike any they had seen before. Its face was grotesque, elongated in an unnatural way, with eyes that seemed to glimmer in the dim light. The flickering candle inside cast shadows that danced across the walls in an almost hypnotic rhythm. Jake clutched Sophie's hand and whispered, "It's looking at us, isn't it?" Emily tried to laugh it off, but the unease in her chest tightened. She led the children back down the street, telling them it was time to return to the safety of the more populated houses. When they returned home, Tom was waiting with their own carved pumpkins, unaware of their encounter. But as the family settled in, there was a sudden soft tapping at the front door. Tom opened it, expecting perhaps a neighbor or a lost child, but no one was there. Instead, there was a single pumpkin sitting on the doorstep, its face even more horrifying than the one on the mysterious house. Tucked into the mouth of the pumpkin was a small note, scribbled in uneven handwriting, "I see you." Emily felt a chill creep up her spine. The pumpkin had not been there before. Tom picked it up, but as soon as he touched it, a low, almost inaudible whisper filled the air around them. The children clung to their parents, wide-eyed and trembling. They brought the pumpkin inside, hoping to calm themselves, but the candlelight inside seemed to flicker with a life of its own. Shadows stretched and twisted along the walls, forming shapes that resembled figures, tall, thin, and faceless. The family huddled together, ignoring the clock's ticking, afraid to move. Over the next few nights, the disturbances escalated. Pumpkins appeared on their porch every evening, each carved with increasingly grotesque faces, each containing notes with messages that grew more personal. "You looked at me. I'm closer than you think. You can't hide." The children became afraid to sleep in their rooms, claiming they could see figures moving just beyond their bedroom windows. Tom tried to rationalize it, blaming pranksters or local kids, but Emily knew this was something else entirely. One night, Emily woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside their bedroom. She reached for her phone, but it had no signal, as if the house itself had cut them off. The footsteps stopped just outside their door, and a whisper slithered into her ear. "Open the door." Her heart raced as she shook Tom awake. They listened in terror, but when they finally gathered the courage to step into the hallway, there was nothing there. Yet the air was thick with the smell of damp earth, and the faint outline of pumpkin carvings seemed to have been etched along the walls in shadows. Desperate for answers, Tom suggested they visit the local library the next day to research the house at the end of Maple Street. There, Emily discovered the history. The house had been built in the 1800s by a man named Victor Greaves, who had been obsessed with the harvest and Halloween traditions. Local legend claimed he had practiced dark rituals during the season, leaving behind objects, especially carved pumpkins, that were said to carry a piece of his spirit. Over time, families reported seeing strange lights, hearing whispers, and sometimes even vanishing pumpkins appearing on their doorsteps. The house had been abandoned for decades, but it seemed Victor's presence had never truly left. That night, the Harper family tried to stay together in one room, lights blazing, hoping to stave off the inevitable. But just after midnight, they heard a soft scratching at the window, followed by a low hum that sounded like it came from beneath the floorboards. Shadows flickered in patterns that mimicked their movements. Then, as if drawn by an unseen force, the pumpkins from the previous nights appeared in the corners of the room, one by one, carved faces glowing ominously in the dim light. Emily screamed when she noticed the first note, stuck inside the mouth of a pumpkin. "I've been inside with you all along." The family clutched each other, trying to comprehend the impossibility. Shadows began stretching across the walls, converging into shapes that resembled human forms, their faces featureless but their presence undeniably hostile. The air grew colder, heavier, and every exhale formed visible mist in the room, despite the heat being on. Suddenly, the front door slammed shut with a deafening crash. The windows rattled violently, and a chorus of whispers filled the room, repeating in overlapping layers, "You saw me. You can't hide." Tom tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The family was trapped, and the shadows moved closer, reaching out as if to envelop them. As if to envelop them. Sophie clutched her mother and screamed, and Jake cried out for his father, but the room seemed to swallow their voices. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the room went silent. The shadows retracted, the whispers ceased, and the pumpkins vanished. The front door was ajar, beckoning them to flee. The Harpers didn't hesitate. They ran through the house, grabbed what they could, and left in the middle of the night, driving aimlessly until the first light of dawn. When they returned weeks later to collect their belongings, the house was empty, lifeless, and still as though nothing had ever occurred. But the memory lingered, an invisible mark left on their minds. From that Halloween onward, every time Emily and Tom saw a carved pumpkin, they flinched. They never returned to Maple Hollow, leaving their home behind, but locals whispered that the house at the end of Maple Street still watched every Halloween. New pumpkins appeared on unsuspecting doorsteps, carved with faces that seemed to move in the candlelight, each accompanied by notes that made the recipient's blood run cold. "I saw you. I never left." The Harpers' children, now older, still wake up some nights screaming, recalling the whispers and the shadows, and Emily herself can't forget the sensation of eyes following her, the soft breathing just beyond the walls, and the unnatural flicker of candlelight that seemed alive. Even today, she warns anyone who mentions moving to Maple Hollow, avoid the house at the end of Maple Street. Ignore it. Never look too closely. Because if it sees you, it won't forget. And neither will you. Story. The night air was unusually still for early October in Cedar Falls, Iowa. Normally there would be the faint sound of cars on Main Street or the laughter of children running door to door for candy. But that year, the town felt quieter, almost hollow. Halloween was approaching, and the older kids often liked to test themselves by exploring the abandoned houses on the outskirts of town, daring each other to knock on doors or step inside. But nobody dared the house at the very end of Willow Lane, an old Victorian mansion that had been empty for decades. Locals said it was cursed, haunted by a family that had vanished one Halloween night in the 1950s. Ethan Carter, a 21-year-old college student home for the break, didn't believe in ghosts. He had grown up hearing the stories, but he always chalked them up to small-town superstition. That Halloween, he and his friends decided to challenge the legend. "It's just a house," his friend Kyle said, flashlight in hand. "We'll go in, take a few pictures, freak ourselves out, and leave." Ethan laughed, adjusting his own camera strap. He had brought his DSLR intending to document the trip. There was something satisfying about capturing abandoned buildings, the way decay could tell stories words never could. The group made their way down Willow Lane, the gravel crunching underfoot, leaves swirling with each step. The house loomed ahead, enormous and dark. Its windows were broken, the siding blackened with rot. The front door was partially hanging off its hinges. A pumpkin, eerily intact despite the years, sat on the porch, its carved face twisted and almost malevolent. "All right," Kyle said, trying to sound brave. "First one to scream loses." Ethan rolled his eyes but followed. He switched his camera to video, shining the flashlight ahead. The house smelled like damp wood and mold, a smell so strong it made his stomach turn. Inside, the air was thick and cold. Their footsteps echoed against the walls, and every shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally. The main hallway was lined with peeling wallpaper, and old furniture was covered in thick dust. As they explored, Ethan noticed scratches on the walls, small handprints smeared in something dark, almost like soot, but too thick to be that. "Do you guys see that?" Ethan whispered. Kyle shrugged. "Probably rats, or kids messing with the place before us." They continued cautiously, moving toward the staircase leading to the second floor. As they climbed, Ethan's flashlight flickered, then went out, plunging them into darkness. Heart racing, he fumbled with the switch, but before he could turn it back on, a voice came from the landing above. Go. Away. It was barely audible, but unmistakable. The three froze. That's not funny, Kyle stammered. Ethan felt a cold sweat prickling the back of his neck. It's probably the wind, he muttered, but even to his own ears it sounded weak. The whisper repeated, louder this time. Go. Away. Something moved at the top of the stairs. A small, pale figure hunched over, its head rocking from side to side. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. Ethan raised his camera, but when he pressed record, the screen went black, like the camera itself had been drained of power. The figure let out a high-pitched laugh, a sound that made Ethan's stomach knot. Then there were more. From the corners of the hallway, children began to appear, dozens of them, pale, wet-eyed, their movements jerky and unnatural. They surrounded Ethan and his friends, whispering, calling their names, laughing softly in voices that didn't belong to the living. Run! Kyle shouted, but the door behind them slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. Ethan and Kyle slammed against it, but it wouldn't budge. Ethan turned to find another path, and his flashlight caught something on the floor, a trail of tiny footprints leading toward the basement door. Against every instinct he followed, terrified but compelled to see where it led. The basement was dark, damp, and smelled of decay. The walls were covered in old photographs, black and white images of children with hollow eyes, their mouths twisted in silent screams. Ethan recognized some of the children, missing kids from Cedar Falls over the decades. The whispers grew into a chorus, filling the room with a sound that made his ears ache. Then he saw her, a small girl standing alone in the corner, her dress tattered, her eyes dark and empty. She lifted her hand and pointed at him. Stay. Ethan felt paralysis creep over him. His friends were screaming, but the sound felt distant, as if coming from underwater. The children began to move closer, a wave of pale, silent figures surrounding him. Their hands reached out, cold and clammy, brushing against his skin. The whispers became a roar, and Ethan realized with a gut-churning certainty that they wanted him to stay forever. He forced himself to move, crashing into the basement stairs, pulling Kyle and his other friend after him. They burst out of the house into the night, gasping for air. Behind them, the house seemed to shudder, as if angry, and the pumpkin on the porch glowed faintly, its jagged grin wider than before. They ran to their cars, shaking and silent, only speaking when they were a safe distance away. Ethan's camera had been damaged in the basement, but the faintest traces of static and shadow had been captured on the memory card. Small, pale figures, standing where no one could be, their eyes fixed on him. The next day, Ethan tried to tell people what had happened. Most laughed it off as intoxicated exaggeration. But that year, Cedar Falls saw an unusual spike in missing children, reports of strange sounds near the old Victorian mansion, and dozens of people claimed to see shadows moving in the broken windows. By Halloween's end, the house had been boarded up permanently, but the whispers never stopped. Ethan left Cedar Falls shortly after, but every October, he dreams of that basement, those hollow eyes and the cold, clammy hands reaching out for him. Even years later, when he moves to different cities, he can feel them following him, whispering his name, reminding him that the house is patient and that it waits. One Halloween night, he got a text from an unknown number. There was no message, only a photo attached. It showed a small pumpkin sitting in an empty lot, carved in a jagged, familiar grin. And in the dirt at the base of the pumpkin, the words were scratched. See you soon. Ethan never returned to Cedar Falls. But every year he knows the house is out there, waiting for someone curious enough to come too close. And for those who dare, the house always gets what it wants. Story the end. The night of October 31st, 2019, started off like any other Halloween in the small Illinois town of Chesterton. The streets were lined with jack-o'-lanterns, the smell of burning leaves hung in the air, and the sound of children's laughter echoed through the crisp evening. I was 26 at the time, renting an old 2-story house on the outskirts of town, a creaky, drafty place built sometime in the 1940s. I worked nights at a local diner, so I wasn't much for holiday celebrations, but that year Halloween happened to fall on one of my rare nights off. It was around 7:30 p.m. when I shut off the porch light to signal the end of trick-or-treaters. The kids had thinned out. I didn't feel like getting up every few minutes to answer the door. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, put on some music, and sat near the window, watching the last of the costumed kids head home under the amber glow of the streetlights. That was when I noticed him for the first time. At first, I thought it was just another teenager playing a prank. Across the street, standing perfectly still beneath a flickering lamppost, was a man wearing a dirty scarecrow mask, the kind with rough burlap stitched into a crude smile. He didn't move, didn't wave, didn't even flinch as a car passed by, just stood there. I remember staring for a few seconds before pulling the curtain shut. Probably some high schooler trying to freak people out, I thought. Chesterton was small, and every year there was always someone trying to one-up the previous Halloween's pranks. Around 9 p.m., I went upstairs to my bedroom. My window faced the backyard, which bordered a patch of woods that stretched for miles. I'd lived there 6 months and had never once been brave enough to wander back there after dark. I was just scrolling through my phone when I heard the first thump. It came from downstairs, faint but distinct, like something heavy had been dropped on the floor. I froze. The house was old, it creaked constantly, but this sound was different, measured, intentional. I turned down the music, holding my breath. Another thump, this time closer, maybe from the kitchen. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept next to the nightstand and crept out of the bedroom. The hallway was dimly lit by a nightlight, casting long, eerie shadows along the walls. I descended the stairs one creaking step at a time. When I reached the bottom, the living room was empty. The front door was still locked, and the curtains were drawn. I turned toward the kitchen, and that's when I saw something that made my stomach drop. One of the back doors, one I knew I'd locked, was standing open. The night air blew in softly, cold and sharp, and a few leaves had blown across the floor. I stepped closer, clutching the bat tight, trying to see into the darkness beyond the porch light. Nothing. Just the swaying trees. I closed the door, locked it again, and checked every window. Everything else seemed secure. I told myself maybe I'd forgotten to that earlier. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When I went back upstairs, I noticed my bedroom window was open. Only about an inch, but I never left it unlocked. I stared at it for a long moment before locking it again and drawing the blinds. I lay in bed that night, wide awake, every tiny sound of the house keeping my nerves on edge. Sometime after midnight, I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember was the sound of my phone buzzing. A message notification. I groggily reached for it, my eyes adjusting to the faint glow. Unknown number. Nice house. I blinked, staring at the message, my heart starting to pound. My first thought was that it was one of my friends messing with me, but none of them lived anywhere near my house. I typed back, "Who is this?" No response. I lay there staring at the screen until the light from it began to fade. That's when I heard it. A slow, dragging sound coming from outside the bedroom door. I sat up, listening hard. The sound was faint, like something heavy scraping across the floorboards, inching closer to my room. Then it stopped. I could feel my pulse in my throat. I held my breath, waiting, but the silence stretched on. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I stood up, bat in hand, and approached the door. I reached for the knob and turned it slowly. The hallway was empty. But there, smeared across the wooden floor, was a thin trail of mud leading toward the stairs. I followed it down, my bare feet making no sound against the cold wood. The trail led to the living room, where the front window curtains were drawn slightly open. I pushed them aside, and there he was. The Scarecrow Man. He was standing in my yard, no more than 20 feet away, facing the window directly. Even through the mask, I could tell he was staring at me. My breath caught in my throat as I realized his hands were covered in something dark, mud, or maybe something worse. I ducked away from the window, crawling toward the side wall, my phone clutched in one hand. I dialed 911. The operator's voice was calm, practiced, asking for my address. I whispered the details, my voice trembling, trying not to make any noise. She told me to stay put, that officers were on the way. Then, faintly, through the phone, I heard it, a low chuckle, distorted and static-filled. It wasn't the operator's voice. My stomach dropped as the line went dead. The sound came again, this time from outside, a deep, guttural laugh muffled by the mask. I crawled back toward the window and risked another glance. He was gone. The yard was empty. I waited, frozen, for what must have been 15 minutes before I saw flashing blue lights outside. The police searched the property, the woods, even the nearby fields. They found nothing. No footprints. No mud. No signs of anyone being there at all. One of the officers told me it was probably a Halloween prank and that they'd patrol the area just in case. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, when I went outside, I noticed something strange. My jack-o'-lantern, which had been sitting on the porch railing, was gone. In its place was a new one, freshly carved. The face was crude and uneven, but the mouth, stitched in jagged lines, was eerily similar to the mask that man had been wearing. I called the police again, but by the time they arrived, the pumpkin was gone. Over the next few days, I tried to forget it. I convinced myself that maybe someone was messing with me. Halloween pranks, weird coincidences, nothing supernatural. I even laughed about it at work. But the next week, another message came. Unknown number. You forgot to say thank you. I blocked the number immediately. That night, as I got into bed, I noticed something small sitting on my windowsill. A single, dried corn husk. I hadn't opened that window since Halloween night. I threw it out and tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that mask. A few nights later, the sounds started again. Scraping, whispering, tapping against the walls, always just faint enough to question if I'd really heard it. I stopped calling the police. They already thought I was paranoid. Then came the final night. It was late November, a bitter cold evening with the first snowfall of the season. I was sitting on the couch half asleep when the power went out. The sudden darkness was suffocating. I lit a candle, the tiny flame barely enough to illuminate the room. And then, 3 knocks at the door. Slow. Deliberate. I didn't move. My breathing quickened as the knocks came again, louder this time. I grabbed my bat, approached the door, and yelled, "Who's there?" No answer. I pressed my ear to the wood, trying to listen. Then, suddenly, a voice, deep and rasping, whispered right through the door. "Nice house." I stumbled back, nearly dropping the bat. The voice was identical to the one that had spoken through the phone. The knocks resumed, louder, faster. Then, silence. The wind outside picked up, howling against the walls. I waited for hours, too terrified to move, until eventually, exhaustion overtook me. When I woke, the sun was rising. The door was wide open. Snow had blown inside, covering the floor in a thin white layer. I stepped outside, trembling, scanning the yard. There, carved into the snow with what looked like bare hands, were 3 words, "See you soon." I packed up and moved that very day. Left everything behind. The furniture, the clothes, the dishes, everything. I didn't even tell anyone where I was going. That was 5 years ago. I live in Colorado now, in a secure apartment building with cameras and deadbolts and neighbors who don't mind keeping an eye out. I never celebrate Halloween anymore. I turn off all the lights, close every curtain, and wait for it to pass. But last night when I checked my phone before bed, there was a new message waiting from an unknown number. "I found you." And attached was a photo, a blurry image of my apartment building, taken from across the street. Story, the end. The first time Emma realized that Halloween in her hometown was different, she didn't fully understand it. She was 13, and the excitement of costumes and candy outweighed any adult warnings about staying inside after dark. Her friends had dared each other to go all the way to the old cemetery at the edge of town, the one nobody went near after sunset. Emma wasn't superstitious, but there was a part of her that felt uneasy as she followed her friends down the cracked sidewalks, their pumpkin buckets swinging with every step. The town itself looked alive in an odd, unnatural way that night. Lights flickered along streets that were usually quiet, and leaves skittered across the pavement in the cold wind, though the weather forecast had promised calm. Kids were still out, laughing and running from door to door, but a strange hush seemed to settle over the far side of town, where the cemetery sat just past an abandoned row of homes. Emma's best friend, Lily, nudged her shoulder and grinned through her vampire teeth mask. "Scared?" Lily whispered. "Not really," Emma said, though her voice was tighter than she intended. They approached the cemetery, its wrought iron gates rusted and half ajar. Gravestones jutted out at odd angles, weathered by decades of rain and frost. Some were toppled, Some cracked, but all bore the kind of names that sounded too familiar to Emma. They were her town's founding families, her neighbors, people her parents had grown up hearing about. A chill ran down her spine. Bet no one's actually in there, Lily said, trying to sound brave. She grabbed the gate, giving it a push, and it creaked loudly, echoing across the still night. Emma followed reluctantly, feeling a pressure in her chest she couldn't explain. The air smelled different here, damp earth, mold, and something else, metallic, that made her stomach twist. She tried to convince herself it was just imagination, fueled by the eerie setting. They wandered between the gravestones, joking quietly, daring each other to touch the older markers. Emma's flashlight flickered, and she cursed under her breath, tapping it against her hand. Lily shivered despite her costume, and Emma noticed she had gone unusually quiet, her eyes darting across the shadows between the stones. "That one's creepy," Lily whispered, pointing to a stone nearly swallowed by vines. "Looks different." Emma leaned closer and noticed a symbol carved into the rock, faint but precise. It looked like a circle with lines branching off, like a spider's web. Something about it felt wrong, unnatural. Her skin prickled. She traced the carving with her fingertip. The stone was cold, almost ice-like despite the mild autumn night. A sudden rustle behind them made Emma spin around. The other kids had run ahead, chasing their dares, leaving Emma and Lily alone. For a moment, all she could hear was the wind through the trees. Then came the whisper, a soft, sibilant voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Leave, now." Emma froze. Lily grabbed her arm. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "Yes," Emma said, though she wished she hadn't. The voice was insistent, almost pleading. It sent shivers down her spine. She wanted to run, but her legs felt rooted to the ground. The whispering grew louder, overlapping, almost like a chorus. Emma's flashlight flickered violently, and shadows seemed to shift in impossible ways. She thought she saw a figure at the edge of the gravestones, tall and thin, faceless, moving just at the corner of her vision. When she blinked, it was gone. "Come on," Lily said, tugging at her hand. "We're leaving. Now." They ran through the cemetery, tripping over roots and stones. Behind them, Emma thought she heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, not her own. Her heart hammered as she glanced back. Shapes seemed to press against the gravestones, emerging from the shadows, darker than darkness itself. Once they were out of the gates, the normal sounds of Halloween returned. The laughter of children, the ringing of doorbells, the distant hum of traffic. The normalcy was jarring, almost cruel after what they had just experienced. Emma felt her chest heave, trying to catch her breath. Did anyone else hear that?" Lily asked, still shivering. "I don't know," Emma admitted, but deep down she knew they hadn't imagined it. Over the next few days, Emma noticed small things. Her bedroom door would be ajar when she was sure she had closed it. Her mirrors seemed to catch movement that wasn't there, and when she walked past the cemetery during the day, the circle she had traced with her finger seemed faintly etched into the air, visible only to her. The following Halloweens were worse. The whispering came back, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes when she walked alone near the cemetery. She stopped going near the abandoned homes, stopped talking about the cemetery, but the feeling followed her, like a shadow that never slept. Her friends moved on, some forgetting, some too scared to speak. But Emma remembered everything, the shapes, the voice, the cold that reached into her bones. She learned, eventually, that some things are tied to places, to nights, to specific moments. Some doors, once opened, never close completely. And every year when Halloween approaches, she feels that pressure again, that whispering just beyond hearing, the sense that something is waiting, not for candy, not for fun, but for the curiosity of those foolish enough to wander into what they cannot understand. Even as an adult, Emma avoids the cemetery after dark. She still lives in the same town, and every Halloween she catches glimpses, shadows in her peripheral vision, shapes standing silently at the edge of her yard. The adults tell stories to children, warning them to stay away from the old cemetery, from the abandoned homes, from the woods. Some believe it's just tradition. Emma knows better. There are nights when she lies in bed, the wind moaning outside, and she hears the whisper again, soft but insistent. She shuts her eyes tight, praying it's a dream, but deep down, she knows it isn't. Whatever waits in the darkness, it remembers her. It remembers the circle, the cold, the fear. And every year it waits again, patient, silent, and hungry for the curiosity of those who dare to wander into its world. Story the end. It was a chilly Halloween night in suburban Pennsylvania, in a quiet town where the streets were lined with old maples and every house seemed to compete for the best decorations. Kids ran from door to door, their laughter echoing down the block, while parents lingered in groups, chatting and keeping watch. Among the crowd were three friends, Alex, Jenna, and Marcus, college students home for the weekend. They weren't planning to join the trick-or-treaters. Instead, they had an idea to explore an old, abandoned section of the town that everyone whispered about, but few dared to enter, the Hawthorne Asylum. The asylum had been shut down in the 1980s after a series of unexplained deaths. Stories circulated about patients who vanished without a trace, doctors who performed unethical experiments, and night staff who swore the building itself was alive with something dark. The town had tried to tear it down multiple times, but the structure always stood, slowly crumbling but refusing to disappear. It had become a dare among the local teenagers. Spend a night inside and see if you could make it till sunrise. Alex, always the bravest or the most reckless, suggested they go that night. It's Halloween. Perfect timing. If we don't do it now, when will we? Jenna hesitated. She wasn't afraid of ghosts per se, but the asylum had a sinister reputation that even she couldn't ignore. Marcus shrugged, half joking, half serious. It's just an old building. Probably some rats and bats. Worst case, we get scared and leave. They parked a few blocks away, the old iron gates of Hawthorne looming in the moonlight. Rusted and bent, they creaked ominously as Alex pushed them open. The asylum's facade was cracked and overgrown, ivy crawling up its walls like veins. Broken windows reflected the orange glow of nearby streetlights, though most were dark, like empty eyes staring down at them. Inside, the air was thick with decay. Dust hung in the beams of their flashlights, motes floating lazily as if the building had been holding its breath for decades. The floors creaked beneath their steps, echoing through the long, empty halls. Old wheelchairs, hospital beds, and rusted instruments littered the rooms, each telling a story of lives once contained within these walls. At first, it was exploration, moving from room to room, making jokes to ease the tension. But as they ventured deeper, the air grew colder, and a faint, almost imperceptible hum began. It wasn't mechanical. It was like someone singing softly, out of tune and far away. "Did you guys hear that?" Jenna asked, stopping mid-step. Alex shook his head. "Probably the wind through the broken windows." Marcus frowned. "Yeah, probably." But even as he said it, the hum persisted, faint but undeniable, growing steadily louder as they moved further into the building. They reached a long hallway lined with patient rooms, each door hanging open or shattered. The hum seemed to come from the far end, where the main treatment wing had been. As they approached, they noticed something strange. The walls, though covered in peeling paint and mold, bore scratches. At first, it looked like normal wear and tear, but as they drew closer, it became clear. These weren't random. They were letters, symbols, and even faces etched into the plaster as if someone or something had clawed at the walls in desperation. Alex shone his flashlight on one particular room. The door was slightly ajar, and inside, the air was colder than anywhere else in the building. On the floor lay a single patient gown, yellowed with age, with a dark stain spreading across the chest area. The hum grew louder, now accompanied by faint whispers that seemed to swirl around them. "Maybe we shouldn't be here," Jenna whispered, gripping Marcus's arm. "Relax," Alex said, though the quiver in his voice betrayed him. "It's just old clothes and echoes. Old buildings do that." He stepped into the room, flashlights sweeping over the floor and the walls. The whispers intensified, and for a brief moment, the shadows seemed to move on their own, shifting, curling toward them. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them with a force that made them all jump. "Open it! Open it!" Marcus yelled, pounding on the wood, but it wouldn't budge. Then, from somewhere deeper in the asylum, a low, guttural voice spoke, saying a single word: "Leave." The three froze. The voice wasn't coming from a person. They could feel it vibrating through the walls, through the floor, through their bones. Another whisper joined it, then another, forming a chorus of voices, all chanting the same word in hollow, anguished tones: "Leave. Leave. Leave." Alex tried to push the door, but it was as if something unseen held it shut. The temperature dropped sharply, their breath visible in the flashlight beams. Shadows began to stretch and twist across the walls, forming shapes that looked like the patients they had read about. The ones who had vanished, the ones whose screams had been recorded in old hospital logs. Jenna screamed as a figure appeared at the end of the room. It was translucent, humanoid, but its face was distorted, stretched like a nightmare. Its eyes, hollow black pits, fixed on them, and it raised a skeletal hand, pointing directly at Alex. He stumbled backward, tripping over the gown on the floor, and the figure vanished instantly. Marcus grabbed Jenna's hand, trying to pull her toward the door. "Come on! Now!" The door suddenly swung open on its own, as if releasing them from a grip. They bolted down the hallway, not stopping for anything. Behind them, they could hear the whispers growing fainter. But the cold followed them, trailing down the corridors, into the stairwells, as if the building itself was trying to claim them. When they finally burst out into the night, the gates slammed shut behind them with a deafening clang. They didn't stop running until the asylum was a distant silhouette against the moonlit sky. Panting, covered in sweat and grime, they reached Alex's car and drove home in silence, the adrenaline still coursing through their veins. They tried to rationalize it afterward. Fear, echoes, imagination. They told themselves those were the explanations. But none of them slept that night. Every creak of their houses sounded like the asylum's floors. Every shadow seemed alive. Marcus found scratches on his arms in the morning, faint but deep, that he had no memory of getting. Jenna swore she saw faces pressed against her bedroom window at night, staring in, though she lived on the second floor with no immediate neighbors. Alex often woke to the hum again, faint at first, but growing stronger as the night wore on. The experience haunted them long after that Halloween. They never spoke about the asylum in detail again, but each of them felt its presence lingering, a reminder that some places carry the past with them, and some entities are bound not by walls, but by the lives they touch. Years later, the asylum was scheduled for demolition. Alex, driving past on a crisp October evening, saw the building looming against the gray sky, windows dark, walls crumbling. But in one upper window, he swore he saw a shadow move, just for a moment, watching him, waiting. He didn't stop. He couldn't. Story the end. It was Halloween night in a quiet suburban town in Ohio, the kind of place where streetlights flickered like they were too tired to work, and the houses sat lined up like rows of watching eyes. I was 17 at the time, and like every teenager in town, I had been looking forward to Halloween for months, not just for candy or costumes, but for the thrill of venturing into the kind of places adults warned you about. That year, the plan was simple. My friends and I would hit a few houses, maybe pull a small prank or two, and eventually end up at the old Miller house on the edge of town. It had been abandoned for years, and the stories about it ranged from tragic deaths to dark, inexplicable disappearances. The evening started normal enough. We carved pumpkins, painted our faces, and loaded our backpacks with flashlights, candy bags, and a few snacks. As the sun went down, we set out on foot, the streets almost empty except for a few younger kids trick-or-treating and the occasional dog barking in a yard. The air had that unmistakable bite to it, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made the shadows look alive. By the time we reached the Miller house, it was completely dark. The house had always looked sinister, but at night it seemed almost sentient. Its windows were dark and grimy, the curtains torn, and the front yard overgrown with weeds taller than any of us. A rusted swing squeaked slowly in the wind, though the air was still, and the front steps looked like they could collapse under the weight of a person. We paused at the sidewalk, trying to psych ourselves up, joking about ghosts and curses, while secretly hoping none of it was real. "Ready?" I asked, trying to sound confident. "Nope," muttered Sarah, but she came anyway, gripping my arm. The front door was warped but not locked. With a hesitant push, we squeezed inside. The smell hit us immediately. Damp wood, mold, and something else, metallic and bitter, that made my stomach churn. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and our flashlights barely penetrated the gloom. Old furniture was stacked in corners, broken and decayed, cobwebs draped over picture frames and shelves like curtains. We started in the living room, the beam of my flashlight catching glimpses of faded wallpaper and dust motes dancing in the air. At first, it seemed like nothing was happening, but then Sarah froze. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I listened. At first, nothing. Then came a faint scratching, coming from somewhere upstairs. The sound was slow, deliberate, like fingernails running along wood. My stomach dropped, but I tried to laugh it off. "Probably just a raccoon or something," I said. But the scratching continued, now accompanied by another sound. Whispering. Faint, garbled, almost like voices muttering in a language none of us recognized. It seemed to come from every direction at once, moving with us as we shifted around the room. "Let's just go upstairs and see what it is," Jake said, trying to sound brave. We hesitated. The stairs were old, each step groaning under our weight. I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching us, aware of every movement, every breath. The whispering seemed to grow louder the higher we climbed. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched ahead, dark and narrow. Doors lined the walls, most of them closed, some hanging crooked on their hinges. The air was colder here, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in the flashlight beams. We decided to check the first room on the left. The door creaked as we pushed it open. Inside, there was nothing but an old bed, a dresser, and a cracked mirror leaning against the wall. But as we stepped in, the whispering intensified, almost as if the house was responding to our presence. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind us. The sound reverberated through the hallway like a gunshot. I ran to the door, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Sarah screamed, and Jake pounded on the door as well, but it remained locked, solid as stone. Then we heard it. Footsteps. Slow, dragging, coming from the other side of the room. We spun around, and in the mirror, we saw her. A woman, her face pale and expressionless, standing in the corner. Her hair was long and matted, and her eyes were black voids. She didn't move, didn't speak, but the air around her seemed to pulse, like the room itself was breathing. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaking. The mirror rippled, like water disturbed by a stone, and then the whispering became clear. Not words, not sentences, just our names repeated over and over. Ethan, Sarah, Jake, Ethan, Sarah, Jake. I felt cold fingers brush my arm, though no one was there. The room grew darker, shadows thickening until the corners seemed to close in on us. Panic set in. I slammed against the door again, and this time it opened just enough for us to squeeze out. We ran down the stairs, each step echoing, though we were certain no one else was in the house. Outside, the night air hit us like a wall. The house loomed behind us, silent now, but the sense of being watched lingered. We ran to the street and didn't stop until we reached my car parked at the end of the block. None of us spoke for minutes, just staring at the house in disbelief. We left town the next day for the weekend, trying to forget what happened. But even weeks later, I couldn't. Every night, I would wake up at 3 a.m., my heart racing, feeling as though someone was standing in my room, watching me. Sometimes, I could hear the whispering again, faint, indistinct, but unmistakable. Years later, I heard that kids who dared to go into the Miller house that Halloween never came back. Some were found days later wandering in the woods, muttering names in a language no one could understand. Others vanished entirely. The house still stands, boarded up now, the paint peeling and the yard overgrown. People avoid it, crossing the street if they have to pass by. I never went near that street again, and every Halloween I get a callous feeling in my chest, the same one I felt that night. The Miller house doesn't forget, and it doesn't forgive, it waits. And every Halloween, it whispers, reaching for anyone foolish enough to come near. Story the end. It was the first week of October when things started to feel off in my town of Ashfield, Massachusetts. I had recently taken a temporary teaching job at the local high school, and I was living alone in a small, old Victorian house I had rented on the outskirts of town. Ashfield was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, the kind of town with narrow streets, white picket fences, and houses that looked perfect on a postcard. But once the sun set, the charm turned eerie. Shadows stretched across the streets, and the wind whistled through the trees in a way that made you feel watched. I didn't really notice it at first. My days were filled with lesson plans, meetings, and after-school tutoring. But when night fell, I started to feel uneasy in my own home. It began with small things. Objects slightly out of place, the creak of the floorboards when no one was there, the sense that someone was standing just outside my window. I chalked it up to the house being old. Then one evening, as I was grading papers in the dim glow of my desk, I heard it. A soft tapping at the front door. Tap, tap, tap. My heart skipped a beat. It was the kind of knocking that wasn't casual, that carried a weight with it. I told myself it was probably a prank, some kid messing around before Halloween. But when I looked through the peephole, the porch was empty. I went to bed uneasy, and that's when it got worse. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of footsteps pacing back and forth on the porch. Heavy, deliberate steps. I tried to ignore it, thinking that maybe it was an animal, but the steps were too large, too slow to be anything small. My bedroom window faced the front yard, and when I peeked through the blinds, I saw a figure. It was a man, tall, dressed in black, and completely still. I couldn't make out his face, but his presence filled the yard like a physical weight. I froze, paralyzed with fear. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there. After what felt like hours, I mustered the courage to reach for my phone, but by the time I looked back, he was gone. The next day, I asked around town casually about strange sightings. The locals exchanged uneasy glances and offered vague warnings. Elm Street, one man said quietly before changing the subject. Some houses are different around this time of year. I went home that night and double-checked all the locks, windows, and doors. The house felt colder than usual, like the air itself was pressing in. Around midnight, I heard the scraping sound first, slow and deliberate, like fingernails dragging along wood. I got out of bed and slowly approached the living room. The front door had a dark shadow in front of it, like someone was standing there, just out of reach of the porch light. I didn't dare open the door. Instead, I tried to call the police, but the line was dead. My hands shook as I dialed 911 on my cell, but there was no signal. The shadow moved slightly, and I felt it. A suffocating presence that made it hard to breathe. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. Suddenly, there was a knock. Slow, deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I whispered to myself, "Go away," and backed away. Then, as if sensing my fear, the knock stopped. Silence. But the weight didn't leave. It was like the air itself was heavy with his presence. I stayed awake the rest of the night, watching the door and windows. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind made me flinch. I didn't sleep. When the first light of dawn finally broke through, I cautiously stepped outside. The yard was empty, but the ground near the porch was disturbed, like someone had dragged something heavy across it. Over the next few days, things escalated. I would see him in the shadows at the edge of my vision, standing in the woods behind my house, sometimes across the street, never moving, always watching. Objects in the house would move on their own. Books on the shelves, a chair slightly turned, doors left unlocked. The feeling of being watched never left. On Halloween night, I barricaded the doors and windows, but it didn't matter. Around 11:45 p.m., I heard the slow footsteps on the porch again, tap, 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 and then a voice, low, barely audible, whispering my name. I froze, realizing that no one else in town could hear it. The sound came inside my head, but it felt real, physical. I ran. Out the back door, into the woods. Fog had rolled in, thick and suffocating. The branches seemed to reach for me, the ground uneven beneath my feet, but I didn't stop. Behind me, I could hear him. Slow, deliberate steps, keeping pace without effort. I ran until I reached the main road, where the town lights cut through the darkness. I collapsed there, gasping, the sounds of pursuit gone. I never went back to that house. I left Ashfield the next day, driving through the night until I reached the city. Even now, I can't go near old Victorian homes. Can't walk alone at night in small towns, because I know he is out there, waiting for the first week of October, waiting to watch, waiting to choose. Years later, I read a local news story. Another child had gone missing near Elm Street. Witnesses claimed to see a tall figure in black, but authorities dismissed it as a prank or urban legend. I knew better. I had seen him. I had felt him. And I knew that he waits every year, every Halloween, silent, patient, relentless. Story the end. The Halloween of 2017 was supposed to be a normal night in Haverhill, Massachusetts, a quiet suburban town where the scariest thing you'd usually find was a raccoon tipping over your trash can. The leaves had turned brittle and copper-colored, the air smelled like wood smoke and candy, and families filled the sidewalks with kids in costumes. That was the year my best friend, Mike, convinced me to tag along to what he called the scariest haunted house on the East Coast. I wasn't much for Halloween stuff anymore. College had dulled the excitement, and haunted houses felt like overpriced jump scares. But Mike was relentless, and his girlfriend, Rachel, was going too. I didn't want to be the only one stuck home scrolling through social media while they had fun. The haunted house, called the Haverhill Harvest Haunt, was a charity event run out of an old property just outside of town. It had been shut down for years after some accident, but this was its grand reopening. The house was on the edge of a wooded hill surrounded by cornstalks and rusted fencing. As we drove up, the last rays of sunset slipped away, and a thin mist began to roll over the fields. The organizers had gone all out. Actors in grimy masks stalked the parking lot, and the wind carried the sound of distant screams from inside. Mike was practically vibrating with excitement, but the pit of my stomach tightened the moment I stepped out of the car. It wasn't just nerves. There was something wrong with the air around that place. It felt heavy, thick, almost electric, like the air before a storm. We bought our tickets, signed a waiver, which struck me as a little intense, and joined a group waiting by the porch. The house was massive, all rotting wood and leaning shutters, with a faint orange glow from the windows. The guy at the entrance wore an antique plague mask and greeted us with a raspy voice. "Once you go in," he said, "you finish the tour, no matter what." Everyone laughed nervously, but his tone didn't sound like a joke. He held open the door and a wave of cold air rolled out, smelling of mildew and dust. Inside, the house was dim, lit by flickering lanterns that barely cut through the gloom. Cobwebs hung from the ceilings. Fake or not, I couldn't tell. The first few rooms were typical haunted house setups. Actors in tattered clothes, jump scares timed with strobe lights, recordings of screams, and chains. It was cheesy but effective. Mike kept joking loudly to mask his nerves while Rachel clung to his arm, laughing. Then we reached the cellar entrance. A narrow staircase led down into pitch-black darkness. A man in an apron stood at the top, holding a lantern, his face hidden by a burlap sack mask. He motioned for us to go down. The others in our group hesitated, but Mike, of course, went first, laughing. I followed close behind, the wooden steps groaning under our weight. The air grew damp and cold as we descended. When we reached the bottom, the lights went out. The laughter and chatter from the group vanished instantly. We stood in silence, the kind of silence that feels thick, suffocating. Then, faintly, a woman's voice whispered from the dark. "Turn around." Rachel let out a shaky laugh. "Okay, that's creepy." But the voice came again, closer this time, sharper. "Turn. Around." A light flickered on, dim and yellow, illuminating the cellar. It looked less like a staged set and more like an actual basement. Old furniture covered in sheets, rusty tools on a table, and on the far wall, something that made my breath catch, a series of photographs tacked to the wood. They were of people, real people, blurry Polaroids showing terrified faces caught mid-scream. In one, a man was looking directly at the camera, eyes wide, mouth open, as though he'd just seen something behind the photographer. "Okay," Mike said nervously. "That's weirdly realistic." Rachel pointed toward a photo in the center. "That one," she started, but her voice faltered. It was of her. Same face, same hair, wearing the exact jacket she had on. She backed up instinctively, bumping into someone behind her, but when we turned, no one was there. That was when the lantern in the corner shattered, plunging us into blackness again. I heard movement, fast, jerky, uneven footsteps circling us. Mike yelled something, and I felt someone grab my arm. Cold, clammy fingers. I yanked away and stumbled backward, my hand brushing against a wall that felt slick with something wet. Then the faint smell hit me, metallic and coppery, blood. "Mike?" I called. "Rachel?" No answer. Then, from somewhere deeper in the basement came the sound of laughter. It wasn't the pre-recorded kind. It was low, real, guttural. A man's laugh, followed by slow footsteps. A faint light flared ahead, a phone flashlight. Rachel's voice came shaky through the dark. "We need to get out of here. Now." We moved toward the light, but the layout of the cellar seemed wrong. The walls weren't where they had been. The stairs were gone. Every turn led to another hallway that hadn't been there before. The air felt heavier the deeper we went, thick with moisture and decay. Then the voice came again. "Turn around." Mike spun and shone the light in the direction of the voice. For a split second, I saw someone standing at the far end of the corridor, wearing that same burlap mask as the man upstairs. Only this time, the mask was soaked through with dark, wet patches. "Hey!" Mike shouted, his voice cracking. "This isn't funny, man!" The figure tilted its head, and I heard a sound that didn't belong in any haunted house, a wet, dragging inhale, like someone breathing through a collapsed throat. The flashlight flickered and died. What happened next came in fragments, screams, footsteps, the crash of something falling. I remember running, hitting walls, hearing Rachel sobbing somewhere nearby. Then, silence. I don't know how long I wandered in that dark maze before I saw light again. I stumbled out a side door into the cold night air, my lungs burning. I looked around for Mike and Rachel, but they were gone. The line of people waiting outside looked confused as I burst out, covered in dust and sweat. The organizers swarmed me, demanding to know how I'd gotten out. I told them my friends were still inside. They looked at me strangely. "Sir," one of them said, "no one's gone in yet." I blinked at him, disoriented. "What are you talking about? We were just in there." He shook his head. "We opened in 10 minutes. The crowd stared. The doors were still chained shut. There were no other entrances, no sounds from inside. The employees checked, even brought police later, but they found nothing. No hidden basements, no photographs, no sign of anyone else. For weeks after, I was questioned, doubted, accused of playing some elaborate prank. No one believed me. They said Mike and Rachel must have run off or gotten lost. But they never showed up again. Months later, I tried to forget. I moved away, started over. But that Halloween, I got a package in the mail. No return address, just my name in black ink. Inside were 3 Polaroid photos. The first was of Mike, eyes wide, face pale, frozen mid-scream. The second was of Rachel, her mouth open, blood on her cheek. The third was of me. The background was the cellar wall. Every Halloween since, I receive another photo. Always me, always a little closer. The last one arrived yesterday. It shows me asleep in bed, the faint shadow of a figure standing over me in the corner of the room, burlap mask, wet and dark, head tilted just slightly. Story the end. It started like any other Halloween in the small town of Millfield, Pennsylvania. The air was damp, thick with the smell of fallen leaves and the faint tang of smoke from chimneys. The town wasn't big, but it had its traditions. Families decorating their porches with cobwebs and fake skeletons, kids running from house to house with candy bags, and a kind of restless energy that only came once a year. My friends and I, Mark, Lily, Connor, and I, were all back from college, itching for a real scare. Haunted houses and cheap jump scares didn't interest us anymore. We wanted the real thing, the kind of story you'd tell years later and still shiver. We had heard the rumors about the Holloway house on the outskirts of town. Abandoned for nearly 40 years, it had once belonged to the Holloway family, a wealthy household with dark tales surrounding their name. Some said a tragedy had occurred there. Children disappearing, strange rituals, neighbors reporting screams late at night, but no one really knew the truth. The house was a decaying Victorian mansion, hidden behind overgrown weeds and skeletal trees. We parked at the edge of the gravel road leading to the house. The moon was just a sliver in the sky, barely illuminating the tall structure in front of us. Even from a distance, it looked wrong, its silhouette crooked and jagged against the night, windows dark and hollow like empty eye sockets. "You sure we want to do this?" Lily whispered. Her voice trembled, and I could tell she wasn't just worried about getting caught. Connor shrugged. "It's just an old house. Nothing living in there." I tried to reassure everyone, though my stomach was nodding with the same fear I was brushing off. We had our flashlights, our phones, and a reckless sense of bravado. That should have been enough. It wasn't. The front door was surprisingly easy to push open. A moan of rust and broken hinges echoed through the empty hall. Inside, the smell was thick and choking. Damp wood, rot, and something that smelled faintly like iron. The air felt heavy, as though the house itself were pressing down on us. We explored slowly, flashlights sweeping across the walls. The furniture was decayed, covered in layers of dust and cobwebs. A grand staircase led up to the second floor, its steps groaning ominously under our weight. Paintings on the walls were faded, and the faces in them seemed to follow us as we moved. In what had once been the living room, we found a small table with an old, cracked mirror leaning against the wall. Connor joked about it, making ghost faces at the reflection. but I couldn't look too long. There was something off about the glass. It didn't quite reflect us right. For a split second, I swore I saw someone standing behind us, though when I turned, no one was there. We decided to go upstairs. The floorboards were uneven, each creak echoing like a scream. Halfway up, Mark stopped. "Do you guys hear that?" he asked. At first, all I could hear was our own breathing and the scuffle of shoes on wood. Then it came, a soft, dragging sound like someone or something being pulled across the floor above us. The sound paused and then started again, closer this time, circling above our heads. Lily grabbed my arm. "We shouldn't be here. We shouldn't be here." We pressed on, but our bravado had evaporated. In the main bedroom, we found a journal on the floor, its pages brittle and yellowed. The entries were erratic, written in a hurried scrawl. They spoke of a presence in the house, something watching, something that could imitate voices and footsteps. One entry read, "I hear them whispering in the walls. They know I'm here. I cannot leave. I cannot leave. They wait." The last page was smeared with what looked like dried blood. "Do not come. Do not come. The house keeps us. The house takes." A sudden crash made us spin around. The bedroom door slammed shut by itself. Connor tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in. The temperature dropped sharply, and our flashlights flickered. Then the whispering began, a soft, almost hissing sound coming from the corners of the room. "Leave, leave, leave." Mark pounded on the door. "It's just the wind," he shouted, though none of us believed it. We finally forced the door open and ran down the stairs, but the house seemed to stretch endlessly. Hallways twisted in ways that didn't make sense. Doors led to rooms that weren't there before. We realized then that the house wasn't just abandoned. It was alive. It was watching, guiding, and trapping us. In the living room, the front door slammed in our faces. We tried the back exit, but it led only to a brick wall that hadn't been there moments before. Windows refused to open, and every attempt to break one resulted in the glass cracking, but not shattering. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, mocking, "You can't leave. You can't leave. You belong." We huddled together, trying to figure out what to do. That's when I noticed something on the wall, a shadow that didn't belong to any of us. It stretched and shifted, moving independently, and I swear I saw the outline of a face with hollow eyes staring right at me. Then it disappeared. Hours must have passed. Time had no meaning in that place. Exhaustion set in, but the house seemed to feed on our fear, pulsing, shifting, keeping us trapped. And then we heard footsteps. Not ours, not someone else's, but heavy, dragging steps moving toward us. Lily screamed as a cold, invisible hand seemed to grip her shoulder. I felt the same, an icy pressure pressing against my chest. Connor yelled, but his voice sounded distant, swallowed by the walls themselves. We ran blindly through the maze of hallways, stumbling, cutting our hands on splintered wood. Finally, we found a door that led outside, or at least we thought it did. We pushed through, and for a moment, the night air was sweet, normal. Relief washed over us. But as we turned to look back, the Holloway house loomed impossibly taller, darker, and alive. The windows seemed like eyes now, wide and hungry, and in one of them I could swear I saw a shadowy figure, watching, smiling, watching, knowing we had tried to escape. We never spoke of that night again, not in full, not in detail, but every Halloween we feel it, the memory, the pull, the whispers in the wind. Sometimes, driving past the outskirts of Millfield, we see a faint light flicker in one of the top windows, though the house has no electricity. And sometimes, just sometimes, the whispers come back, carried on the wind through the trees. Leave, or stay forever. Years later, I learned that the Holloway family had vanished without a trace. The town didn't know why, and the house remained, decaying, waiting, feeding on curiosity and fear. People still dare each other to go near it, and some never return, though no one talks about them. I never go near that part of town anymore. But sometimes, in my sleep, I hear the dragging steps and soft whispers, and I realize that the Holloway house is still there, alive and waiting. It remembers. It waits. And it doesn't forgive. Story the end.